Today on True Patriot Love, we're pleased to welcome one of Canada's most thoughtful literary voices, Don Gilmore. Gilmore grew up in Western Canada and studied English at the University of Calgary, graduating in 1977 before beginning a career that would take him from oil fields to newsrooms and ultimately into the world of award-winning books. In fact, in his early 20s, he worked on an oil rig in Alberta, an experience that later shaped his deep interest in the energy industry and the human stories surrounding it. Throughout his career, he's balanced journalism with long-form storytelling, spending years as a senior editor at The Walrus and contributing to publications like Toronto Life, where he built a reputation of one of Canada's most insightful profile writers. Today, we're pleased to welcome one of Canada's most thoughtful literary voices, Don Gilmore. Today on True Patriot Love, under the pillar Energy, we're lucky enough to have Don Gilmore. And Don wrote a book, it's called On Oil. He's written many books, but we really wanted to get his opinion on what's going on in the world today, talk about his book, and sort of go back almost to 1973 and talk about what's happened in the crude oil business, the gas and oil business in Canada since. So welcome, Don.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Hey, so I started reading your book and, I really got captivated with it. I went through it and, your experience heading to Alberta, talk to us a little bit about, why as a young man you ventured in there, why you got mixed up in the oil and gas business, and a little bit what you learned.
Well, I grew up in Winnipeg, but I moved to Calgary in 1970, and I was going to university there, and I was looking for a summer job. And everyone I talked to said, if you want to make money, you got to go into the oil business. And so a friend of mine and myself, I lived near downtown, and we just walked around downtown, and we had these very slim resumes, and we dropped them off at every oil company downtown. And then finally, a secretary said to us, he said, you two idiots are never going to find a job this way. There's no point in dropping off your CV. He said, just drive out to where the rigs are. And she said, if you drive east towards Medicine Hat, she said, there's 150 gas rigs out there. Just drive up to them because the turnover is so high. So we did. And, you're out there in the prairie, you can see the rig from 30 kilometers away. So we just drove up to every rig we saw. And, the first rig we got to, it had a sign that said, this rig has worked 0 accident-free days. And there was a guy sitting on a 40-gallon drum, and he had blood all over his hand. It was wrapped in bandages. And so we thought, well, there's a job opening here. But the driller said, you guys you have no experience. He said, I can't use you. And so we drove around for about 3 days. And we finally got to a rig where the entire crew hadn't shown up. And these are pretty small crews. These are kind of 3-man crews. And so he looked at us. This was the 70s. We had kind of long hair and our, Grateful Dead T-shirts. And he looked at us and said, well, I guess you girls will have to do. And he hired us. And that was the beginning of my life in oil. And, in many ways, it's a terrible job. It's dirty. It's dangerous. It's 7 days a week. There's literally no days off, and they work through any kind of conditions. But on the other hand, you did make a ton of money, and because I just moved to Alberta, it was a really colorful subculture, and I was an English major, and I thought, well, this is a kind of interesting world. So I came back every summer and ended up in the oil world.
Oh. Wow. That's interesting, and it's funny because, I not in the oil business, but I actually worked, put myself through university at a stockyard on St. Clair Avenue. And it was cattle and it was brutal. And same thing. I went and I stood in a bullpen, and a gentleman would come out and he'd actually pick people to work. And I had so many days working, and he liked me, so he kept me on full time. It's amazing the way people got jobs back in. And I tell my kids that all the time, and they think I'm actually telling this tall story, but it really is where you got jobs. You went from door to door. you were kind of, it's interesting because you tell, in the 70s, I went, and because of all that's going on in Iran right now, and, you hear about gas and gas prices. I think today, crude is at $97 a barrel US. It's crazy amount. I went back and I started looking at the history of, gas, oil and gas in Canada. And, I went back to 73 because 73 was when the Yom Kippur War between Egypt, Syria, and Israel took place, and it broke out, and basically the embargoes happened because of the relationship between the U.S. and the relationship between Saudi Arabia. And so very, very captivating, and in your book, you're in the middle of this, almost like you're basically, the government has decided in 75 that they're going to get into the oil business. So in comes, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and he actually makes the decision that he's going to start Petro-Canada. And then tell me a little bit, about what was going on in Alberta at that time, because I know the premier, and up into the 80s, Premier Lockheed was just angry. He was just really pissed off that he had started Petro-Canada.
Yeah, it was an interesting moment because once we had the embargo in 73, that really transformed not just the oil landscape, but I think, the actual physical landscape in Calgary, because suddenly you have oil going up, the price of oil quadruples in a short period of time. And as a result, you have the industry expands at a rapid rate, and you have all these people coming into Calgary looking for work. And suddenly Calgary is booming. We've got like 30,000 people coming, every year. The suburbs are going out. And you can see oil as this sort of dominant force. And I think, Trudeau recognizes this, and certainly Lougheed did, who was a very astute manager of the resource, I think, and maybe the last astute manager of the resource in Alberta. But out of that, you got the Petro-Canada, and then you had the National Energy Program, which came in, in 1980, and that, which is still, demonized in Alberta, and in some cases for good reason. But one of the initial aims of that program was energy independence, which was, I think, a great aim, and had it been achieved, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. Unfortunately, I think there was a couple of things wrong with the National Energy Program. One, it was being sold by Trudeau, who was a French-speaking Eastern elite, and so not a great salesperson for Alberta. And the other thing was, it was a bit of a Trojan horse for expanding federal powers, and Lougheed recognized that and was certainly upset about it. But had that been, or had some version of that been implemented, then we'd be in a situation where we did have something much closer to energy independence, which we don't have because the East still imports a lot of its oil from Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Algeria, Norway, various places, and the U.S. especially. And so it has put us in a bit of a bind.
Yeah. Don, it's interesting. So, this weekend or over the weekend, I know the Prime Minister went to Norway, and, I was watching that to see sort of the conversations with Equinor. And I went back and I was doing some research because I was very curious to see. I'd always heard about Statoil or Equinor, and I'd read about it years ago, and I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to dig in a little and read over the weekend. And I was astounded. I'm a CPA by trade, so I like numbers. So I jumped in and I started doing some research on this company. The company started at the same time that basically Petro-Canada did. So if you think about it, Norway made the same decision. So here we were in 1973, a really crazy time in the world where embargoes, And we'll talk about in a minute. The impacts of the embargoes were absolutely insane throughout the world, and the embargo was really just 6 months. So the embargo was from October to March 73 to 74, and here we were. Norway made the decision to go another direction. So Norway said, "Okay, we're gonna get heavily into the oil business. We're gonna make it a nationalized industry." And it's grown, and it's basically grown today to 100 billion a year revenue business for the country. It does about 9 billion in net income, and it's grown to a $2 trillion industry, which has created a wealth fund that is unbelievable for the country. The country, for a small country, and I was, I'm always looking for stats because I was an ex CPA, as I mentioned. I didn't know that, there's only 5.6 million people in Norway. So it's a relatively small country, as you probably know. And their GDP per capita is 86,000, which is roughly about 30% more than Canada. We're about 54,000. So it's a fairly wealthy country at a fairly small land mass. It's only 300,000 square kilometers. So, I was looking at it, I'm thinking, wow, this is really interesting. And to your point, what a turning point. Like, it's amazing, like that policy decision that we made at that time caused us to go down this road. And this company that the Norwegians set up controls basically 60% of the total production. They then branched out and they now operate oil and gas fields in Brazil, even here in Canada, China, Libya, Nigeria, Russia, UK, US, Venezuela, processing plants in Belgium, Denmark, France, and Germany. And they've expanded to pipeline building. They have a pipeline building now business, a solar, a wind at home, and in Scotland and Poland. So they have wind turbine companies. And they have 2,500 gas stations. So, like, they took this and blew this up to a whole other level where it's interesting. We went the other direction, and we actually, as of 1980, I think it was Mulrooney, if I'm correct, he disbanded Petro-Canada, went the other direction, and decided not to get out of the business, really, from a nationalized perspective, and never really had any interest in going back. And then we've kind of I know in your book, you talk about it quite a bit. We've actually went towards a green agenda, which I think we're all EVs, and we're all think that's a great idea. But now we seem to be caught, like, we're middled at this point. We seem to have middled ourselves a little because we didn't pick a lane. And when we finally picked a lane, we're now in the middle of this crisis, right?
Yeah, and I think, Norway's often held up as this sort of example of how best to manage the resource. And I think they did a brilliant job. And, one of the metrics we can use is when I lived in Alberta, the Heritage Fund, which was started by Lougheed, I think it had 11 billion in it at that point. And the idea was this was money that was set aside for, Albertans in lean times. And Norway started their fund not long after. And I think the Heritage Fund has something like, you may know this better than I, but it's something like 18 or 19 billion in it after all these years. And I think the Norwegian fund is just shy of 3 trillion at this point. I think it's 2.9 trillion. It's in the trillions anyway. And so, what's happened, I think the biggest difference is, oil to some degree has always been a kind of private-public partnership, either implicitly or explicitly. And I think that partnership worked to great benefit in Norway. And I think what happened in both Alberta and in Canada is that relationship, we got the worst of both worlds, where, at one point, Lougheed has said, he made it very clear that the resources of Alberta are owned by Albertans, and they are the landlords, and that the oil companies are the tenants. And I think that relationship essentially switched, and starting in certainly as early as 92 when Ralph Klein came in as premier. And I think you suddenly had the oil companies become the landlords, and essentially the people of Alberta become the tenants, kind of wealthy tenants, but tenants nonetheless. And so the management of those resources, when Lougheed went up to the years after he retired as premier, he went up to the oil sands and said, he thought this was a sort of a crime, that here was this moonscape, and who was it benefiting? And he said, it's not benefiting the people of Alberta because they're not getting the royalties they deserve. And so if Albertans aren't benefiting, certainly the rest of Canada is not benefiting. And what you have is a small group of people who are, deriving tremendous benefits from this, but it's not kind of echoing through the economy the way we would hope. And so now we're, as you say, we're stuck in this we're kind of between things. And that situation, I think, was exacerbated when Alberta Premier Daniel Smith said, we're going to put a moratorium on renewables, because they had the most vibrant renewable industry in Canada, as well as the oil and gas industry. And so you had this tremendous kind of concentration of energy. And then suddenly all investment in renewables stops, and you're losing both income and expertise and investment, and to some degree confidence in that government. And you revert back to, we're going to be, an oil and gas economy. And so, I think we found ourselves in this sort of middle ground that isn't benefiting us as much as it could have.
Yeah, and it was. I did find it interesting, the trip to Norway, Prime Minister Carney, and I thought he did a great job. He met with shipping companies, the one major shipping company. He met with the guys from Equinor, had good meetings. The challenge is it's the timeliness of it, and that's really what's the challenge now. Is we're behind the 8 ball, and he started talking to them about going offshore in Atlantic Canada. So he said, okay, you guys are the expert in offshore drilling. Why don't you, take a look at it, think about an investment? And I was like, oh my goodness. And then back home in Alberta, he recently, just before he left, they actually reverted some of the environmental regulatory restrictions, and he put them back in the hands of the provinces. And I'm like, okay. So now, we were struggling with that because, federally and provincially, you couldn't agree on the environmental protections. So now you've agreed to put it back in the hands of the province. So he did that. And I'm like, okay, fine. You made a decision, whether I like the decision or not, it's a decision. And at this point, on many shows that I do, I say to people, you know what, I might not like the decision, but at this point, you got to be making decisions, right? Because we're getting kind of stymied by inaction at this point. So now we're kind of, it seems like in a little bit of a we're backpedaling a little bit. We're now saying, okay, we want to go back into the pipeline business in some shape or form, and we want to do more offshore drilling. And to your point, to Lockheed's point, we're now trying to bring a group of people who started when we did, really got into the oil business in a big way when we did. And we're saying to them, come into Canada. And because you guys made so much money, and I was, when I got into the Equinor story, I was amazed how much control they even have in America right now. So, I looked at the fund, and I was like, the National Bank of Norway has, through the wealth fund, has major stakes in the Bank of America, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. And when they make a decision, for example, to support or not support Caterpillar, or even foreign funds, Israel funds, and that, the governments of those countries and the U.S. actually get actively involved from the White House to make sure that Norway keeps their money invested in the U.S. and other nations. So this has become a very powerful fund. And we're now asking them to come into Atlantic Canada and to invest money and expertise that they've gathered through all these subsidiary companies, and to start move our oil and gas forward, and to start back into this industry. So, we were kind of we were for 10 years saying to Canadians, we're getting out of this industry, or we're going to minimize this industry. We're going into the EV industry, and now all of a sudden we've kind of turned, and we're having meetings with people to come back in and go back into the industry. And
and I think we're at this point right now in the kind of oil and gas history that's there has been these pivotal points over the years, and we're at one right now again. And I think what you have is people, especially when you have a crisis like we have right now in terms of the Iran war and a spike in oil prices. And so you have people saying we need to get the oil to Tidewater, Alberta oil. We need to build more pipelines. We need to all these things. But I think if you look at Carney's decision, and I agree, I think we're at a point where decisions have to be made, and there was this kind of period of indecision. And my guess, and I don't know that this is the case, but when you have Premier Smith saying, "Listen, we have to get rid of all the kind of environmental hurdles, and we have to kind of," and if you do that, if you make it possible and plausible to build a pipeline, I'll put together this consortium of private interests and we'll build a pipeline. And my guess is he may have called her bluff, which is, we'll reduce the regulatory period to 2 years, I think it is now, from it was 4 or more in the past. And then you put together this consortium and you finance 100% of this pipeline. And right now, I think we're a little more than a month away from the deadline, and so far there still isn't a pipeline company on board. And I think if you look at infrastructure, you're looking at kind of how the industry is moving. And we spent $34 billion to build Trans Mountain, and it took 12 years. And so I think those companies are thinking, if we're actually financing this, and it's it's going to cost us another 34 billion and take us all this time, what does the market look like 12 years from now? How green has Europe gotten? How green has China gotten, or Japan? And we see the same thing in the US, where with oil refineries, the last major oil refinery was built in 1977, and there's been dozens that have shut down since then. And even the CEO of Chevron said, "I don't think you'll ever see another major oil refinery built in America, because the timeline is that it's similar to pipelines. It can take 10 years to build a major refinery. It can cost between 10 and 15 billion." And I think no one wants to put in that kind of money into what they suspect is kind of a sunset industry, despite the fact that it'll go on for a long time. But it's unlikely it's going to be a robust industry. And you have a situation now where I think in terms of global investors, it was 2-to-1 in terms of renewables versus oil and gas last year. You had twice as much investment in renewable resources as you did in oil and gas. And so you can see which way this is going. And so it puts everyone in a difficult position. I don't think that the pipeline makes any sense. I think what'll happen is you'll see the premier coming back and saying, "Listen, this benefits all of Canada, and it's a nation building program. And so even though we said it was going to be privately financed, we actually need federal money." And I think that's where the Prime Minister has to hold the line and say, a deal is a deal. We did our part. If you can't find the private financing for this, then clearly there isn't a market for it. So let's look at something else. And the offshore drilling, I think, is sort of in between there, where the infrastructure costs aren't as great, the timelines are shorter, you've got this expertise. So that may be something that happens, and you could see some short-term benefit. But I think the pipeline deals, or the idea of having new refineries, or the Energy East, the revival of Energy East, that all these we probably won't see.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think that's a great analysis of it. I took a look. I also took a look. I was interested to see what were the impacts of the embargo. Because, now you're starting to see different parts of the world seeing the stresses of the oil price increase and everything else. And it was interesting, some things I had forgotten. I was young but alive at that point, and I was trying to figure out, um, did the market crash? And the market did crash in the US. So they did have a stock market crash in 73, 74. Um, I do remember red, yellow, green signs. My dad was a truck driver, so we used to do long haul truck driving. So we'd be in and out of Michigan all the time as a kid, and I do remember gas stations that had red flags on them, which meant they were out of gas. So that they did have a shortage of gas. I remember odd and even license plate days, where you could only get gas on the day, depending on the last number of your license plate. Also, I had forgotten that the president of the United States had actually used that for the catalyst for nuclear power. So that was an interesting one that I thought, to your point about renewables, but also, in Ontario right now, we're doing a major push into nuclear right now. So even though we miss some timing on some things, we actually are ahead of the curve on other things. So, that might be a savior for us in the end if our skill sets in the nuclear reactor business keep growing and getting better and better and better. And I think we kind of are world leaders in that regard, which is great. The conflicts that occurred, I didn't, and this was an interesting one. I had forgotten a lot about Africa or South Africa. Civil wars broke out. India's Indira Gandhi used it to actually create a dictatorship. Moscow and Japan basically got into a very big argument about Kuril Island and the take back of that property. And Eastern Europe was really fragmented, with Britain actually not allowing the U.S. to land planes, or France to land planes or use airstrips, because they didn't want to get cut off from oil and gas. So it's interesting now that we're watching all these conversations take place. And I thought on the weekend, when Germany came out and basically said that they weren't part of this war. So you're starting to see the fragmentation in Europe right now of people saying, hey, hold on, I'm not part of this war, right? And so it's interesting how the world did fragment quite a bit, and how you saw the splitting up of different parts of the nation, and the breaking. And so I'm curious, what it does, in your opinion, to the world, and what in Canada right now. So we're at that turning point. How does he move forward? And what do you think is the best thing to do now? Because you are in the middle position.
Yeah, and I think the geopolitics of oil. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that President Trump is so gung ho on oil. Is he views it as something that still has a great deal of power on the geopolitical stage, and to some degree he's right. Although it's a fading power, and you see, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and Europe wants to get off of Russian gas. And so one of the good things about these sort of situations is that it just reminds us once again that we need to get away from oil and gas, because otherwise we're going to remain more or less enslaved. But as soon as we get independence, if we do have a renewable grid that is independent of oil and gas, then it doesn't matter if the price of oil doubles in less than a year. And it doesn't matter if there's, invasions and wars. And so I think one of the good things we see with Iran is that, Europe is more resilient now as a result of having to wean themselves off of Russian oil. I mean, they got it from other sources, but they also aggressively pursued, a more green agenda, and they started to look back at maybe reopening some nuclear, and so I think we'll see the same thing with Iran, where you see the spike in oil prices, but you also see people a spike in green energy companies, because that's what's going to power the future, and it's what's going to get us away from these. And this one is so much more delicate. I mean, in a way, it's having less of an impact than 73, because we aren't as dependent on oil as we were in 73, and certainly not as dependent on foreign oil. But the delicacy geopolitically, I think, is much more intense. And you have, Trump, who tends to contradict himself sometimes in the same sentence. And, he was saying how he wants all his allies to help him. Then he also a minute later says we don't need anybody. And then he wants China to help, secure the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, China has been sitting on the sidelines, relatively quiet about all this. And, the Iranians are letting all the Chinese tankers go through, of course, because that's their main client. And so they're not going to be bombing any of the Chinese ships or mining any of them. And so there's no reason for China to kind of be helping out on that front. And, depending on how this kind of goes over the next few weeks, you could see where there's going to be, right now, there's kind of silence on the part of allies other than Germany, who's spoken up and said we're not involved. But I think you could get more vocal opposition saying, especially given the fact that Trump has been unable to really articulate the reason he got into this war. At one point he said it was just to destroy their nuclear capability, but in June of last year, he said they'd already obliterated their nuclear capability. And so, why would you need to do that? And whether it's, to stymie their ability to build ballistic missiles, whether it's regime change, there's, a host of things floating around. And this is going to be, I think, of all the oil wars, of which there's, as you mentioned, there's been dozens over the years that could be defined as oil wars. And while oil isn't the objective here, it's certainly what has been weaponized. And so I think this is, yet again, becomes another oil war. And I think this will be a defining moment in terms of how we go forward in terms of energy production.
Yeah, I think so. And, for Canada, I think it's a turning point for us too. We now sort of, and I find it bizarre every time we have these conversations throughout my lifetime. We're now having, a pricing conversation every day about, what our price per liter is at the pumps. So a net exporting country of crude oil. I know it's heavy oil. I understand the positives and the negatives of what we produce and what we send through the pipelines, mostly into the U.S. But it seems a little disheartening. Again, we're at that point where we're having this discussion and we haven't kind of figured out a path yet. If you had to think about a path for Canada, so I mentioned nuclear, I mentioned you're talking about renewables. Where do you see Canada going? So if you had to kind of give me you've been doing this and you've been looking at oil for years, you were in the industry, crystal ball it for a minute with me. Where would you say we are in 2 years from now?
Well, I think we'll be farther ahead in the renewable world. I mean, the encouraging thing, I think, in the East at least, is the electricity grid is becoming more and more important in terms of, the energy world. And, Quebec has almost, it's almost 100% hydro. There's like, they occasionally use natural gas during, peak hours or something. And Ontario, I think we're using between 10 and 15% gas. But, that figure is going down. And as you say, we're we've got nuclear going on. We've got more solar and wind being installed. Quebec has a lot of wind being installed. And I think the renewable blip in Alberta, I think my guess is one of the problems with both the States and Canada is that the oil and gas world versus renewables tends to be almost entirely political. So, when you have a Republican government in the U.S., you get rid of all the environmental regulations and all the subsidies to renewables, and you give tax breaks to oil and gas, and then the Democrats get in and just reverse that formula. And to a lesser extent, we've seen something similar here, where the Harper government, embraces the oil and gas industry, and for to some degree kind of stymied renewables. And then you have Justin Trudeau sort of sitting on the fence trying to play it, and now we have Carney, I think, looking at the kind of real politic of this, and how do we best manage the fossil fuel resources without kind of destroying the economy, but at the same time managing the environment and then bringing the renewables up. And I think you'll see renewables coming back to Alberta when there is a different government, which I think there's a relatively good chance of. And so for the most part, I think we're moving forward. And I think you'll see the same thing in the US, where depending on what happens in the midterm elections, you could see as early as November, seeing a kind of a sea change in terms of kind of mood. And oddly, even though Trump has done everything he can to kind of squash renewable investment, it's actually gone up during his first year in office. And so you can delay the future, but you can't prevent it from arriving.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And that's great advice and a great comment. Don, thanks again for taking the time. I really appreciate you sharing, your book, some stuff, and some knowledge that you gained by actually working in the industry. For those of you who haven't read the book is called On Oil. And Don, talk about some of the other books you've written, because you've written, I was amazed, how many books you've written, and please take a few minutes to tell.
Well, one of the books I wrote is a novel that's has oil as its main theme, a novel called Long Change. And when I worked in the oil fields, I wanted to write a novel about oil, and I tried to when I graduated from university, but I just really didn't have the tools, I think, at that point. And so I sort of put it on the back burner, but I came back to it kind of 30 years later and finally wrote that novel. So I have a series of novels, that's one among them. And I wrote a 2-volume history of Canada, which was kind of a companion to CBC did a big 30-hour series on the history of Canada called Canada People's History. So I did a couple of books that worked with that. And I've also written children's books as a kind of sideline, I guess. But I'm mostly going back and forth between nonfiction and fiction books, which are kind of a cure for each other in many ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Don. I appreciate the time. And for those of you, please pick up the book. You're going to learn a lot about the history of oil and gas, what's going on in the world. And please remember, download the app and subscribe when you can. And stay tuned for more shows on oil and gas.